In a town where the streets gleam with manicured perfection, and privilege seems like a birthright, the shadows of prejudice can still linger just beneath the surface. Brookwood, California, a place where dreams are nurtured, yet assumptions can shatter them in an instant. This is a story about a bright young woman on the brink of her future, a father whose duty is to protect not just his daughter, but his entire community, and a police officer trapped by his own flawed perceptions. When ambition and ignorance collide, the fallout can be devastating, but it can also plant the seeds of transformation. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's a story of reckoning, redemption, and resilience. A story that asks hard questions. Can we confront the biases we don't even know we have? Can a single moment of pain lead to lasting change? Let's begin with a sunny afternoon, a day that should have been perfect, until the shadows crept in. The California sun blazed high in the sky, casting golden rays onto the pristine streets of Brookwood, a quiet suburb known for its gleaming white picket fences and sprawling front yards. The air was warm with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming magnolias, the kind of day where everything felt possible. Jasmine Taylor gripped the wheel of her father's black luxury SUV, the leather cool beneath her fingertips. She could hardly believe this was real. Stanford University, her dream school. The acceptance letter, still folded in her bag on the passenger seat, was tangible proof that her years of late-night studying and endless perseverance had paid off. Her heart swelled with pride as she thought of her father, Chief Marcus Bennett, who had handed her the keys this morning with a grin that lit up his whole face. "You earned this, Jazz. Go out and celebrate." The memory of his words made her smile. He wasn't just her father. He was her biggest cheerleader, her rock. Chief Bennett had taught her to work hard, to hold her head high, and to always believe in herself. And now here she was, on the cusp of adulthood, freedom stretched out before her like the wide open road. Jasmine's curly hair bounced with the rhythm of the music, playing softly from the speakers. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel to the beat of her favorite song, her eyes shining as she took in the rows of stately houses with their manicured lawns and glistening fountains. "One day, I'll have a house like this," she thought. "I'll make Dad proud." The weight of expectation and possibility sat comfortably on her shoulders. She was ready to embrace the future, ready to prove that a girl from a modest background could thrive in a world of privilege. But fate has a way of twisting perfect moments into something else entirely. Jasmine was so lost in her thoughts that she missed the police cruiser that had quietly pulled out behind her. The faint glint of sunlight off the cruiser's windshield was the only warning, a silent omen of what was to come. Officer Dean Harris adjusted his sunglasses, his gaze narrowing, as he watched the sleek black SUV glide down the street. The vehicle was pristine, gleaming like a polished onyx gem, and the driver, well, the driver didn't quite fit the picture he had in his mind. Dean's lips pressed into a thin line. He'd been on the force long enough to know trouble when he saw it, or so he told himself. The girl behind the wheel was young, black, and from his perspective, looked out of place in this wealthy neighborhood. His mind, worn and hardened by years of assumptions, instantly jumped to conclusions. "No way a kid like that owns a car like this," he muttered, suspicion settling into his bones like a cold draft. Without another thought, he reached for the switch and flicked on his lights and siren. The sudden burst of sound shattered the tranquility of the street, sending birds flapping into the sky and joggers glancing over their shoulders. Jasmine's heart jumped. The sound of the siren was jarring, a needle scratching across the record of her perfect day. She glanced in the rearview mirror, confusion clouding her features. The flashing red and blue lights painted the interior of the SUV in frantic hues. "What's going on?" she thought, her stomach twisting with unease. Carefully, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Through the mirror, Jasmine watched as Officer Harris emerged from the cruiser. He was tall, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. His stride was purposeful, almost aggressive, as he approached the driver's side window. One hand rested near his belt, a gesture that sent a shiver of apprehension down Jasmine's spine. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Stay respectful. Stay calm. You have nothing to fear if you've done nothing wrong." The window slid down with a soft hum. Jasmine managed a polite smile. "Good afternoon, officer. Did I do something wrong?" Harris's eyes narrowed further. He didn't return the smile. "License and registration," he snapped, his voice cold and clipped. Jasmine's brow furrowed, but she nodded. "Of course, officer. It's in the glove compartment." She moved slowly, carefully retrieving the documents. Her hands shook slightly as she handed them over. Officer Harris snatched them from her, his eyes flicking to the name on the registration. Chief Marcus Bennett. His jaw tightened. The name didn't matter to him. His mind was already made up. Suspicion coiled tighter in his gut. He looked back at Jasmine, his gaze hardening. "This car is registered to a Marcus Bennett. Care to explain how you're driving it?" Jasmine swallowed, her voice steady but edged with a hint of fear. "Yes, sir. Marcus Bennett is my father. He let me borrow his car to celebrate my acceptance to Stanford." Harris let out a humorless laugh. "Right. And I'm the President of the United States." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Step out of the vehicle." Her heart pounded. "Officer, I promise, this is my father's car. You can call him. He'll explain everything." "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice rising. Jasmine's stomach churned, fear blooming like a dark flower. She knew arguing wouldn't help. With a shaky breath, she opened the door and stepped onto the sun-warmed pavement. The warmth of the sun now felt like a cruel joke. Jasmine stood tall, trying to summon the confidence that had buoyed her just moments ago. But Officer Harris's gaze was like a spotlight, pinning her to the ground, stripping away her dignity one glare at a time. Her voice trembled. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't done anything wrong." Harris wasn't listening. The shadow of his prejudice had already swallowed any chance of reason. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," he ordered. Tears pricked at Jasmine's eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't let him see her break. As her palms pressed against the smooth metal of her father's SUV, the world around her blurred. The sound of passing cars, the whisper of leaves, it all faded. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart and the distant echo of a dream slipping away. The shadow had arrived, and it was darker than she ever imagined. The sun dipped slightly in the sky, casting long shadows across the pristine streets lined with manicured hedges and flower beds. The air was still, the kind of quiet that usually signified safety and security. But for Jasmine Taylor, that quiet had turned into a suffocating silence. Her pulse drummed in her ears, each beat a stark reminder that her perfect day had unraveled into something nightmarish. Jasmine stood with her hands pressed against the warm metal of her father's luxury SUV. The sleek black finish reflected her wide, frightened eyes. Her breathing came in shallow bursts as she tried to hold herself together, to follow the rules, to stay calm. Her father's advice rang in her mind like a mantra. Stay respectful, stay calm, Stay safe. But how could she feel safe now? Officer Dean Harris loomed behind her, his eyes cold and calculating. His fingers tapped impatiently on the handle of his belt, as if itching to do something more. The weight of his authority pressed down on Jasmine, and every second that passed eroded the confidence she had felt just moments before. "Stay right where you are," Harris barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through steel. "Yes, sir," Jasmine whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt the cool breeze of the late afternoon sweep past her, a cruel reminder of the freedom she was supposed to be celebrating. Instead, she was trapped, pinned by assumptions and prejudice that had nothing to do with who she really was. Sitting in the police cruiser, Officer Emily Carter watched the scene unfold through the windshield, her fingers gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. A knot of unease twisted in her stomach. She glanced at Jasmine, noting the fear in the girl's posture, the way her shoulders trembled just slightly. Emily's training told her this situation was wrong. She knew protocol, knew when force was necessary and when it wasn't. This wasn't necessary. This was a young girl standing by a car that was registered in her father's name. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words lodged in her throat. Her partner's demeanor, the ironclad certainty in his eyes, made her hesitate. Dean Harris wasn't a man who liked being questioned. He had always been rigid, unyielding, and quick to anger. Confronting him felt like stepping into a minefield. Emily's eyes flicked to the radio. She could call for oversight, ask for a senior officer to step in. But the fear of retaliation, the fear of being ostracized by the department, kept her frozen. "Where's the stolen goods, huh?" Harris's voice dripped with disdain. He walked a slow circle around the SUV, his eyes sweeping over the interior, as if he were hunting for evidence to justify his suspicions. Jasmine's throat tightened. "I told you, officer. This car isn't stolen. My father—" "Save it," he snapped, cutting her off. "You think you can just cruise around here in a car like this, without raising suspicion?" Jasmine's eyes welled up with tears, but she fought them back. She couldn't let him see her cry. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Harris's face twisted into a scowl. He didn't hear her words. He didn't see her fear. All he saw was a narrative he had constructed in his mind, a story where Jasmine was the villain, simply because she didn't fit his expectations. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands behind your back." A sharp spike of panic shot through Jasmine's chest. "Please, officer, just call my father. He's Chief Marcus Bennett. He'll explain everything." Harris's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Enough of your lies. Hands behind your back." Her movements were robotic, her limbs stiff and unresponsive. As her wrists met behind her, she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around them, with a finality that made her stomach lurch. The cuffs bit into her skin, cruel and unrelenting. The world blurred as tears threatened to spill over, but she clenched her jaw, forcing them back. She was determined not to let him break her. Harris pushed her gently but firmly toward the patrol car. To Jasmine, it felt like the longest walk of her life. Each step scraped away a layer of her dignity, leaving her exposed and raw. Across the street, curtains twitched and doors opened just a crack. Neighbors peeked out, their eyes wide with curiosity and judgment. Jasmine felt their stares like needles piercing her skin. "They see me as a criminal," she thought bitterly. "They don't know me. They don't care to know me." As she reached the patrol car, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. A young black woman in handcuffs, her face a mask of despair and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to be her story. She was supposed to be celebrating, driving toward her future with joy in her heart. But that future now felt like it was slipping away, one click of the handcuffs at a time. Emily Carter stepped out of the cruiser, her heart thudding painfully. She watched as Harris guided Jasmine into the back seat, his expression impassive. Emily's hands shook as she adjusted her utility belt. The silence was suffocating. "Dean," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure about this?" Harris shot her a look, his eyes flinty. "What's that supposed to mean?" She swallowed hard. "She's just a kid. Maybe we should follow protocol," he snapped. "You don't get to question me on this." Emily's mouth snapped shut, shame washing over her. Her silence felt like betrayal, like she was complicit in the unraveling of an innocent girl's life. She wanted to speak up, to challenge Harris, to stand between Jasmine and this nightmare. But fear kept her rooted in place. The door closed with a hollow thud, trapping Jasmine in a cage of steel and glass. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she fumbled for her phone in her back pocket. The cuffs made it nearly impossible to maneuver, but she managed to pull it out. The screen glowed with familiarity, a tiny beacon of hope. Her fingers shook as she dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Jasmine?" Her father's voice was a mix of confusion and concern. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Dad," she choked out, the tears finally spilling over. "I need your help. I've been arrested. They think I stole your car." There was a heartbeat of silence. Then his voice, sharp and commanding. "Where are you?" "I'm on my way." The call ended, but the echo of her father's promise lingered in her mind. He was coming. He would fix this. But as she sat in the patrol car, her wrists burning, her dignity shattered, she wondered if anything could ever really be fixed. The muted hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unforgiving glare across the sterile off-white walls of the Brookwood police station. The faint scent of burnt coffee and old paper hung in the air, a reminder that this was a place of routine and order. But today, the routine had been shattered, and order was hanging by a thread. Jasmine Taylor sat stiffly on a hard plastic chair, her wrists still cuffed behind her back. The cold metal bit into her skin, a constant reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. The bustling of officers around her blurred into a meaningless drone. Her head hung low, her shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like an invisible anvil. Every whispered conversation, every glance thrown her way, felt like a dagger. She could feel their judgments, their assumptions. Another troublemaker. Probably stole the car. Kids these days. But Jasmine wasn't a troublemaker. She was an honor student, a girl who had just been accepted to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. None of that mattered now. Not to them. Officer Dean Harris leaned against the front desk, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He filled out the arrest report with sharp, precise strokes, his pen scratching against the paper with a determination that bordered on glee. She thought she could just lie her way out of it, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. Unbelievable. A few feet away, Officer Emily Carter hovered by the doorway, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her stomach twisted with guilt and unease. The sight of Jasmine, so young, so vulnerable, gnawed at her conscience. But fear of speaking out against Harris paralyzed her. Her eyes darted to the clock on the wall. Each tick felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something explosive. Suddenly, the double doors of the station burst open, slamming against the walls, with a resounding bang. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot, and every head snapped toward the entrance. Chief Marcus Bennett strode in, his towering frame radiating controlled fury. His dark brown eyes blazed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. His jaw clenched so tightly, it looked like it might shatter. Dressed in his crisp uniform, the gold badge on his chest gleamed under the harsh lights, a symbol of authority, respect, and justice. His gaze zeroed in on his daughter, sitting handcuffed and defeated. For a brief moment, the rage melted away, replaced by a look of pure, unfiltered heartbreak. "Jasmine," he whispered, his voice cracking. Jasmine's eyes lifted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Dad." Her voice was a fragile thread. Bennett crossed the room in 3 strides, his large hands gently cupping her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice trembling. She shook her head, her lower lip quivering. "I'm just scared." A muscle in Bennett's jaw jumped. He stood up straight, his entire demeanor shifting into that of a man ready for war. He turned to Officer Harris, who had gone pale at the sight of his commanding officer. Harris's smirk vanished, replaced by a thin veneer of defensiveness. His fingers fumbled with the papers on the desk. "Chief Bennett," Harris stammered, trying to sound authoritative. "I didn't know she was... didn't know..." Bennett's voice was low, dangerous. The room seemed to vibrate with the force of his restrained fury. "You didn't know my daughter was driving a car registered in my name? You didn't think to verify her story before humiliating and handcuffing her?" Harris's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but found none. The other officers had fallen into a stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and discomfort. "I was following protocol," Harris muttered weakly. She looked suspicious. The words hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Bennett's nostrils flared. "Suspicious? What exactly looked suspicious, Officer Harris? The fact that she's young, or the fact that she's black?" His voice was like ice, each word razor-sharp. Harris bristled. "With all due respect, sir, that's not fair." "Not fair." Bennett's voice rose, echoing through the station. "What's not fair is my daughter sitting here in handcuffs for no reason other than your ignorance and prejudice." The silence that followed was deafening. The air was thick, oppressive. Officers shifted on their feet, eyes darting between their chief and the officer in question. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the raw confrontation unfolding before them. Others watched with grim acknowledgement, the truth of Bennett's words too obvious to ignore. Officer Emily Carter felt her heart hammering in her chest. The moment she had dreaded was here, and there was no escaping it. She took a shaky breath and stepped forward. "Chief Bennett," she said, her voice trembling, I saw everything. She didn't do anything wrong." She tried to explain, but her eyes flicked to Harris, guilt and shame clouding her face. "I should have said something sooner." Bennett's gaze softened slightly as he looked at her. He gave a curt nod. "Thank you, Officer Carter." He turned back to Harris, his eyes blazing. "Remove the handcuffs, now." Harris hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. But the force of Bennett's glare left no room for argument. He moved forward with jerky, reluctant motions and unlocked the cuffs. The metal fell away with a dull clink. Jasmine rubbed her wrists, the red marks stark against her skin. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. Bennett placed a protective arm around her shoulders. "You're coming home with me," he said softly, his voice a balm against the harshness of the situation. He turned back to Harris one last time. "There will be a full investigation into your conduct," Bennett said, his tone brooking no argument. "And I promise you this, Officer Harris, you will be held accountable." Harris's face drained of color, the weight of his actions finally beginning to sink in. As Bennett guided Jasmine toward the door, the eyes of every officer in the station followed them. Some looked away in shame. Others watched with a newfound understanding of the stakes, the consequences of unchecked bias. Whispers rose like smoke in their wake. "Can you believe Harris did that? Chief Bennett's right. That was messed up. This is going to blow up. I can feel it." But for Bennett and Jasmine, the world outside was waiting. Along with the storm that was about to break, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the suburban streets of Brookwood. The tranquility of the evening was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Behind closed doors, in living rooms and on street corners, whispers turned to discussions, discussions turned to debates, and debates grew into anger. It all started with a single video. The clip was just over 2 minutes long, shaky and grainy. Filmed from behind the safety of a thick hedge, the lens captured the exact moment Officer Dean Harris snapped the handcuffs onto Jasmine Taylor's wrists. Her trembling voice, the raw fear in her eyes, and the cold indifference of Harris's face were preserved forever. The caption was succinct but damning. "This is what injustice looks like. Justice for Jasmine a Brookwood bias." Within hours, the video spread like wildfire across Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. Thousands of comments poured in. "Another day, another young black life treated like a criminal. When does it stop? This is happening in my town. Brookwood, we have a problem. Chief Bennett's own daughter. If it can happen to her, what about the rest of us?" The hashtags number Justice for Jasmine, number Brookwood bias, and number Stop Racial Profiling began trending nationally. News outlets picked up the story. Major networks like NBC, ABC, and CNN ran segments dissecting the video frame by frame. Brookwood, a quiet town known for its affluence and tree-lined streets, was now a name on everyone's lips. In households across the community, reactions varied. Some expressed shock and disbelief, clutching their pearls at the idea that this sort of thing could happen in their pristine town. Maybe there was more to it, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, a longtime Brookwood resident, muttered as she scrolled through the comments. "I'm sure the officer was just doing his job." But in other homes, the video ignited a fire that had been smoldering for generations. "Just doing his job," snapped Malcolm Green, a local black activist pacing his living room. "That girl did everything right. Polite, respectful, and she still ended up in handcuffs. That could have been my daughter. That could have been me." His wife, Michelle Green, was already typing furiously on her laptop. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she drafted an event page on Facebook. "Join us for a peaceful protest. Demand justice. Demand accountability. Brookwood Town Square. Tomorrow, at 4 p.m. Justice for Jasmine." As night fell, the division in Brookwood deepened. At the local diner Sammy's Eats, regulars argued over coffee and pie. "This is ridiculous," grumbled Paul Thompson, a middle-aged man in a construction uniform. "Why blow this out of proportion? She should have just cooperated." "She did cooperate, Paul," snapped Lena Martinez, a teacher at Brookwood High. "I've taught Jasmine. She's one of the brightest students I've ever met. This isn't about cooperation. It's about prejudice. You're overreacting." "No, you're underreacting," Lena shot back. "How many more times do we need to see this happen before people get it?" Conversations like these played out in bars, gyms, churches, and supermarkets. Friends turned on each other, neighbors stopped waving, and the tension in the air was palpable. In her office at the Brookwood Town Hall, Mayor Linda Thompson rubbed her temples as she stared at the news reports on her laptop. The video looped again and again, each replay a stab of anxiety. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from constituents, the state governor's office, and local business leaders. Each voice on the other end demanded a response, demanded control, demanded calm. Her assistant, Rachel Kim, entered, her expression strained. "Madam Mayor, the press is outside. They are asking for a statement." Linda sighed, her shoulders slumping. "This is a nightmare," she muttered. "Call a press conference, first thing tomorrow morning. We need to address this before it spirals out of control." Rachel nodded, scribbling a note. "And Chief Bennett?" Linda's eyes narrowed. "Tell Marcus to be there. He needs to speak to this. He's at the center of it, like it or not." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the suburban streets of Brookwood. The tranquility of the evening was deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Behind closed doors, in living rooms and on street corners, whispers turned to discussions, discussions turned to debates, and debates grew into anger. It all started with a single video. The clip was just over 2 minutes long, shaky and grainy, filmed from behind the safety of a thick hedge. The lens captured the exact moment Officer Dean Harris snapped the handcuffs onto Jasmine Taylor's wrists. Her trembling voice, the raw fear in her eyes, and the cold indifference of Harris's face were preserved forever. The caption was succinct but damning. "This is what injustice looks like. Justice for Jasmine, Brookwood bias." Within hours, the video spread like wildfire across Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. Thousands of comments poured in. "Another day, another young black life treated like a criminal. When does it stop? This is happening in my town? Brookwood, we have a problem. Chief Bennett's own daughter. If it can happen to her, what about the rest of us?" The hashtags number Justice for Jasmine, number Brookwood bias, and number Stop Racial Profiling began trending nationally. News outlets picked up the story. Major networks like NBC, ABC, and CNN ran segments dissecting the video frame by frame. Brookwood, a quiet town known for its affluence and tree-lined streets, was now a name on everyone's lips. In households across the community, reactions varied. Some expressed shock and disbelief, clutching their pearls at the idea that this sort of thing could happen in their pristine town. Maybe there was more to it, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, a longtime Brookwood resident, muttered as she scrolled through the comments. "I'm sure the officer was just doing his job." But in other homes, the video ignited a fire that had been smoldering for generations. "Just doing his job," snapped Malcolm Green, a local black activist pacing his living room. "That girl did everything right. Polite, respectful, and she still ended up in handcuffs. That could have been my daughter. That could have been me." His wife, Michelle Green, was already typing furiously on her laptop. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she drafted an event page on Facebook. "Join us for a peaceful protest. Demand justice. Demand accountability. Brookwood Town Square. Tomorrow, at 4 p.m. Justice for Jasmine." As night fell, the division in Brookwood deepened. At the local diner Sammy's Eats, regulars argued over coffee and pie. "This is ridiculous," grumbled Paul Thompson, a middle-aged man in a construction uniform. "Why blow this out of proportion? She should have just cooperated." "She did cooperate, Paul," snapped Lena Martinez, a teacher at Brookwood High. "I've taught Jasmine. She's one of the brightest students I've ever met. This isn't about cooperation. It's about prejudice. You're overreacting." "No, you're underreacting," Lena shot back. "How many more times do we need to see this happen before people get it?" Conversations like these played out in bars, gyms, churches, and supermarkets. Friends turned on each other, neighbors stopped waving, and the tension in the air was palpable. In her office at the Brookwood Town Hall, Mayor Linda Thompson rubbed her temples as she stared at the news reports on her laptop. The video looped again and again, each replay a stab of anxiety. Her phone buzzed incessantly, calls from constituents, the state governor's office, and local business leaders. Each voice on the other end demanded a response, demanded control, demanded calm. Her assistant, Rachel Kim, entered, her expression strained. "Madam Mayor, the press is outside. They're asking for a statement." Linda sighed, her shoulders slumping. "This is a nightmare," she muttered. "Call a press conference, first thing tomorrow morning. We need to address this before it spirals out of control." Rachel nodded, scribbling a note. "And Chief Bennett?" Linda's eyes narrowed. "Tell Marcus to be there. He needs to speak to this. He's at the center of it, like it or not." The large historic building of Brookwood Town Hall loomed over Main Street, its columns casting long shadows in the mid-morning sun. Usually it was a place for routine meetings, town fairs, and quiet bureaucracy. Today, it was a powder keg ready to ignite. Inside, the press conference room was packed wall to wall. Reporters from local and national outlets jostled for position, their cameras trained on the podium. Microphones, each emblazoned with network logos: CNN, ABC, NBC, FOX News, and local affiliates, stood ready to amplify every word to the world. The hum of anticipation filled the room. The air was electric, charged with tension, curiosity, and a simmering rage that threatened to boil over. In a small side room, Chief Marcus Bennett stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his navy blue uniform. His badge gleamed under the harsh lighting, but there were shadows under his eyes. His reflection stared back at him, a man carrying the weight of fatherhood, leadership, and the struggle for justice. Behind him, Jasmine sat on a cushioned bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a simple white blouse and black slacks, her curly hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. The bruises from the handcuffs were still faintly visible around her wrists. Marcus turned to her, his voice low and steady. "Are you sure you want to do this, Jazz?" Jasmine looked up, her brown eyes reflecting both fear and steely determination. "I have to, Dad. People need to hear what happened. From me." He nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "You're braver than I ever could have imagined." A gentle knock at the door broke the moment. Rachel Kim, the mayor's assistant, peeked in. "It's time." Marcus took a deep breath. "Let's go." He offered Jasmine his hand, and she took it. They walked side by side, their footsteps echoing through the marble hallway, each step taking them closer to the storm waiting beyond the double doors. As they entered the room, the chatter died down instantly. The sharp click of cameras filled the silence. Marcus walked to the podium, Jasmine standing just behind him. Mayor Linda Thompson stood to the side, her face a practiced mask of calm and control. Marcus surveyed the crowd, a sea of faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all hungry for answers. He cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. "Good morning. Thank you all for being here." The cameras zoomed in, the world hanging on his next words. "My name is Marcus Bennett, and I am the chief of police here in Brookwood. But today, I stand before you not just as a police officer, but as a father." A murmur rippled through the crowd. 3 days ago, my daughter, Jasmine Taylor, was unjustly detained, handcuffed, and humiliated. She did nothing wrong. She was driving a car that legally belonged to her family, celebrating an achievement she worked incredibly hard for. But in that moment, all that mattered to one officer was the color of her skin. Gasps and murmurs grew louder. Cameras flashed. Some reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Others held their breath. This was an act of racial profiling, Marcus continued, his voice firm. And racial profiling has no place in Brookwood or any other community. It erodes trust, it creates fear, and it stains the very principles of justice that we are sworn to uphold. The room was silent now, heavy with the weight of his words. Marcus paused, glancing back at Jasmine. She nodded slightly, giving him the courage to continue. I know this incident has shocked many of you. Some of you may believe this is an isolated event, a misunderstanding. But for many people in our community, especially people of color, this isn't just an isolated event. This is a reality they live with every day. He took a deep breath. This incident is a wake-up call. And I promise you, we are awake. The Brookwood Police Department will implement immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training, increased accountability measures, and a community oversight board to ensure transparency and fairness. Reporters' hands shot up. Questions were already forming, but Marcus held up a hand. I'll take questions in a moment, but first I want you to hear from my daughter. Jasmine, if you're ready. Jasmine's heart pounded as she stepped forward. The lights were blinding. The eyes of the crowd felt like laser beams on her skin. But she stood tall, gripping the sides of the podium. Hi, she began, her voice trembling slightly. My name is Jasmine Taylor. I'm 18 years old, and I just got accepted to Stanford University. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. She paused, steadying her breath. But instead, I was pulled over, handcuffed, and treated like a criminal because of what I looked like. I was terrified. I did everything I was taught to do. Be polite, stay calm, follow instructions, and it didn't matter. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I don't want anyone else to feel that kind of fear and humiliation. I don't want anyone else to feel like they don't belong in their own community. We can be better than this. We have to be better than this. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the rapid clicking of cameras. The reporters erupted with questions. Chief Bennett, do you plan to discipline Officer Harris? Jasmine, how has this affected your faith in law enforcement? Mayor Thompson, what measures is the city taking to address community concerns? Marcus and Linda fielded the questions with measured responses. Officer Harris has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. We are committed to rebuilding trust through transparent actions, not just words. We will work alongside the community to ensure everyone feels safe and respected. As the questions continued, the atmosphere grew heated. Some reporters pushed back, suggesting the incident was blown out of proportion. Others demanded harsher consequences. Marcus remained calm, his voice unwavering. We are not here to assign blame. We are here to make things right. As the press conference ended, Marcus and Jasmine exited the hall, greeted by a wall of protesters outside. Signs waved in the air. Justice for Jasmine. No more racial profiling. We demand accountability. The crowd cheered as they saw Jasmine. Some people clapped, others raised fists in solidarity. Michelle Green approached Jasmine, a proud smile on her face. You were amazing, Michelle said. You gave them something they couldn't ignore. Jasmine smiled faintly. I hope it's enough. Michelle's eyes sparkled. It's a start. The afternoon sun dipped behind a bank of gray clouds, casting a muted light over Brookwood. The echoes of the press conference still reverberated through the town, rippling through households, the police station, and the lives of those most affected. What had begun as a confrontation on a quiet street had exploded into a storm of controversy, self-doubt, and hard truths. The battle lines had been drawn, but inside each heart and mind, The real struggles were only beginning. Officer Dean Harris sat alone in his small, sparsely decorated living room. The only sound was the faint ticking of a wall clock, each second a reminder that time was running out on his career and reputation. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. The press conference replayed in his mind, each word from Chief Marcus Bennett and Jasmine hitting him like body blows. Racial profiling has no place in Brookwood. She did everything right, and it didn't matter. Dean's jaw clenched as he stared at his reflection in the blank television screen. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, a man who kept the streets safe, who followed protocol. But the voice in his head kept whispering the same question. What if I was wrong? Images flashed before his eyes. Jasmine's trembling hands, the fear in her eyes, the bruises left by his handcuffs. His gut twisted. He had dismissed those images at the time, convinced she was just another kid trying to pull one over on him. But now, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. His phone buzzed. Another message. You're a disgrace. Racist pig. You don't deserve that badge. Dean slammed the phone face down on the table, his breathing ragged. He wanted to defend himself, to shout that he wasn't a racist, that he was just doing his job. But deep down, a crack had formed in his certainty. He thought about the looks on his colleagues' faces at the station, the ones who wouldn't meet his eyes anymore. Even Officer Emily Carter, his partner, had pulled away. The isolation was suffocating. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of shame and confusion pressing down. For the first time in his life, Dean Harris felt truly lost. At home, Jasmine lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the past days felt like a whirlwind that wouldn't stop spinning. The press conference, the protests, the online comments. It was all too much. Her chest felt tight, her mind exhausted. The walls of her room, once her sanctuary, now felt like they were closing in. Her phone buzzed with messages of support. We're with you, Jasmine. You're so brave. Thank you for speaking up. But alongside the support came the uglier messages. Liar. Just playing the race card. Your dad's power won't protect you forever. She turned the phone face down, unable to look at it anymore. The anger simmered just below the surface, tangled with sadness and exhaustion. Her father, Marcus, knocked gently on the door. Hey, Jazz, can I come in? Yeah, she whispered. Marcus entered and sat at the foot of her bed. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and helplessness. You don't have to do this alone, he said softly. I know, she replied, her voice tight. But it still feels like it. I thought, if I did everything right, if I was good enough, polite enough, it wouldn't happen to me. Marcus swallowed hard. I know, and that's what breaks my heart. She looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. How do you keep going, Dad? Knowing that no matter what, some people will always see us as less than. He took a deep breath, his voice trembling. Because we have to, Jazz. We keep going because if we don't, nothing changes. We fight for a world where one day you won't have to ask that question. Jasmine nodded, her fingers curling into fists. I want to fight too. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Marcus's heart swelled with pride. Then we'll fight together. Officer Emily Carter sat at her kitchen table, staring into her cold cup of coffee. Her hands trembled as she replayed the incident over and over in her mind. Dean's voice still echoed in her ears. Just step out of the car, miss. His tone had been hard, dismissive, but she hadn't spoken up. She had stood there, frozen by doubt and fear of betraying her partner. She had seen the look on Jasmine's face, The fear, the confusion. She had felt it in her gut that something was wrong. But she had done nothing. Now she felt like a coward. Her wife, Natalie, entered the kitchen, her expression worried. You haven't touched your coffee?" Emily shook her head. "I can't stop thinking about it, Nat. I should have said something. I should have stopped him." Natalie sat down beside her, taking Emily's hands. "You can't change what happened, but you can decide what to do now." "I'm scared," Emily admitted. "What if I lose my job? What if I lose the respect of the other officers?" Natalie squeezed her hands tighter. "What if you lose respect for yourself if you stay silent?" The words cut deep, but they were exactly what Emily needed to hear. She took a shaky breath. "I have to testify. I have to tell the truth." Natalie nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "That's the woman I love." Chief Marcus Bennett sat in his office late into the night, the glow from his desk lamp casting shadows across his face. The pile of paperwork on his desk seemed endless. Reports, complaints, media statements. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion seeping into his bones. The weight of his roles as a father, a police chief, a black man in a position of authority, pressed down on him relentlessly. He picked up the internal investigation report on Officer Harris, his jaw tightening. There were no easy answers. His department was divided. Some officers felt Harris was being scapegoated, while others demanded swift justice. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer for strength. He knew that whatever decision he made, it had to be the right one. Not just for Jasmine, but for the future of the community. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. It was Emily Carter, her face pale but determined. "Chief, I need to talk to you. I'm ready to testify." Relief and gratitude washed over him. "Thank you, Emily. You're doing the right thing." "I hope so," she whispered. In homes across Brookwood, sleep was a stranger. The town held its collective breath, knowing that change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Dean Harris stared at the ceiling, dread settling deep in his stomach. Jasmine Taylor clutched her father's hand, preparing to face whatever came next. Emily Carter lay awake beside her wife, bracing for the consequences of her truth. Marcus Bennett watched the sunrise from his office window, determined to guide his town through the storm. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would bring judgment. The reckoning was here. The morning air was heavy with tension as the sun's first light crept over Brookwood, casting long shadows across the town. The looming sense of judgment and consequence was palpable, touching every street, every home, and every person connected to the events that had brought Brookwood into the national spotlight. For Jasmine Taylor, Officer Dean Harris, and Chief Marcus Bennett, today was a turning point. Choices made in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the police department would ripple far beyond its walls, shaping the future of the community and the hearts of those within it. The reckoning had arrived. The Brookwood Police Department was unusually quiet for a weekday morning. Officers who typically filled the halls with casual banter moved with tense, clipped steps. Conversations were whispered, eyes darted nervously, and the weight of the upcoming internal review hung like a storm cloud ready to break. In the large conference room reserved for the hearing, the air was stale. A long, polished table sat in the center, flanked by rows of chairs. At the head of the table sat Chief Marcus Bennett, his expression unreadable, his jaw clenched. His presence was a reminder of authority and justice, a beacon that today would be handled with fairness, no matter how difficult. Officer Dean Harris sat at one end of the table, his face pale, his hands folded tightly in front of him. The once cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a haunted look that spoke of sleepless nights and relentless self-recrimination. His uniform, usually worn with pride, now felt suffocating. Beads of sweat collected at his temples, and his throat was dry. To his right sat his partner, Officer Emily Carter. Her eyes were fixed ahead, determined yet strained. The decision to testify against a fellow officer, a partner she had once trusted, gnawed at her. But she knew it was the right thing to do. Truth and justice had to prevail over loyalty to a flawed system. Jasmine Taylor entered the room, her father, Chief Bennett, at her side. She wore a simple yet elegant blouse and jeans, her hair in a neat braid. Though her hands trembled slightly, her gaze was steady. The bruises on her wrists had faded, but the memory of the cold handcuffs lingered like a scar on her spirit. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every step toward her chair. The room settled into a tense silence. The panel overseeing the review, composed of senior officers, city officials, and a community representative, arrived and took their seats. The chair of the panel, Deputy Chief Alora Williams, a woman with steely gray hair and a reputation for fairness, cleared her throat. "This hearing is now in session," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "We are here to investigate the events involving Officer Dean Harris and Ms. Jasmine Taylor, and to determine if misconduct occurred. Let the record show that all parties are present." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on Dean. "Officer Harris, you are here to answer for your actions during the traffic stop on Jasmine Taylor. Do you understand the charges against you?" Dean nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yes, ma'am." "Very well. We will begin by hearing testimony." Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she stood and approached the witness seat. Her father squeezed her hand briefly, his silent support giving her strength. She sat down, took a deep breath, and faced the panel. "Please state your name for the record," Deputy Chief Williams instructed. "Jasmine Taylor." "Jasmine, please recount the events of that day, in your own words." Jasmine swallowed and began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was driving my father's car, a black SUV, through our neighborhood. My dad, Chief Marcus Bennett, let me borrow it to celebrate my acceptance to Stanford. I was excited, happy. It was supposed to be a perfect day." Her voice faltered slightly, but she pushed on. "Ani, then, I noticed the police cruiser behind me. The lights came on, and I pulled over. I was confused. I hadn't done anything wrong." She glanced at Dean, who stared at the table, unable to meet her eyes. "Officer Harris approached my car aggressively. He didn't ask why I was driving the car. He just assumed I'd stolen it. When I tried to explain, he didn't listen. He handcuffed me, humiliated me in front of strangers." Her eyes glistened with tears, but her voice sharpened. "I did everything I was taught to do. I was polite. I followed instructions. And it didn't matter." The room was silent, each word landing like a hammer blow. "Thank you, Jasmine," Deputy Chief Williams said gently. "You may return to your seat." Jasmine stood, her shoulders straighter than when she had arrived. Emily stood next, her legs heavy, her palms sweating. She took her seat and locked eyes with Deputy Chief Williams. "Officer Carter, do you affirm that your testimony will be truthful?" Williams asked. "I do," Emily replied, her voice firm. "Please describe the events of that day from your perspective." Emily took a shaky breath. "I was there. I saw everything. From the moment we pulled Jasmine over, I knew something felt off. She was calm, respectful, and the car's registration was legitimate. But Officer Harris didn't give her a chance to explain." She paused, guilt flickering across her face. "I should have spoken up. I should have stopped it. But I didn't." Dean flinched, the words striking him harder than any accusation. I regret it deeply, Emily continued, her voice breaking. But I'm here now, to make it right. What happened to Jasmine was wrong, and it shouldn't happen to anyone else. She returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but her conscience clear. Dean Harris rose on unsteady legs. The weight of the room's judgment pressed down on him. He took his seat at the witness stand, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake, he admitted. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I didn't listen to Jasmine. I didn't see her as a person. I saw a stereotype. And I was wrong. A tear slipped down his cheek. I'm sorry. I don't know if that's enough. But I need you to know that I'm truly sorry. The room was silent, the echo of his confession lingering. After hours of deliberation, Deputy Chief Williams spoke. Officer Dean Harris, this panel finds you guilty of misconduct and racial profiling. You are suspended without pay, pending mandatory training and review. Further violations will result in termination. The gavel fell. The reckoning was complete. A chilly breeze blew through the streets of Brookwood, carrying with it the weight of recent events. The town was still reeling from the fallout of Officer Dean Harris's suspension. Anger, confusion, and uncertainty lingered in the air, straining the already delicate relationship between law enforcement and the community. But amid the tension, a spark of hope flickered. There was a chance to heal, to rebuild trust. The question was, would people embrace it? Chief Marcus Bennett stood at the entrance of the Brookwood Community Center, his broad shoulders squared, and his face set in determined lines. Flyers fluttered on nearby bulletin boards, announcing the Bridging the Divide initiative, a series of dialogues between the police and the community. This was the first of many meetings aimed at fostering understanding. But Marcus knew the road ahead would be rough. He could already see clusters of townspeople gathering on the steps, their faces etched with skepticism, their eyes watching every police officer who arrived with a mix of wariness and resentment. Marcus turned to Jasmine, standing beside him. She had agreed to speak at the event, and though her expression was resolute, he could feel her nerves. Are you ready? He asked softly. Jasmine took a deep breath and nodded. I have to be. As they entered the community center, they were greeted by the hum of low conversations. Rows of chairs were set up, facing a small stage, where a podium and microphone awaited. The room was a blend of familiar faces, residents, activists, city officials, and police officers, including Officer Emily Carter. She offered Jasmine a small smile of encouragement. In the back corner, Dean Harris stood stiffly, his eyes downcast. Marcus had insisted he attend the dialogue sessions, hoping they would serve as a catalyst for genuine change. The murmur of conversations died down as Marcus approached the podium. He tapped the microphone, his voice clear and calm. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know these past weeks have been difficult for all of us. Trust has been broken, pain has been felt, and anger has been justified. He paused, letting his words settle in. But I believe in this community. I believe we can do better. This initiative is not a quick fix. It's a step toward understanding, toward healing. Tonight, we're here to listen to each other, to speak honestly, and to find common ground. A ripple of cautious applause moved through the room. Marcus stepped back, gesturing for Jasmine to take his place. As she walked to the podium, the weight of the moment pressed on her shoulders, but she squared them, her voice steady. My name is Jasmine Taylor, she began, her eyes sweeping the room. Many of you know what happened to me. I was handcuffed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal because of how I looked. But this isn't just my story. It's a story that happens too often, in too many places. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I could let anger consume me, but I choose to believe in change. I'm standing here tonight because I believe we can learn from this. I believe we can do better together. The room was silent. Her words, simple yet powerful, hung in the air. The floor was open to the audience. One by one, people stood to speak. First was Mr. Henry Ramirez, a shop owner in his 60s, his face weathered by years of hard work. He clutched his hat in his hands as he spoke. I've lived in Brookwood for 40 years. I remember a time when we trusted the police, but that trust has been eroded. We need to feel safe again, to believe that when we call for help, we won't be judged by the color of our skin. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Next, a young mother, Tasha Green, cradling a baby, spoke up. I worry every day for my son's future. I don't want him to grow up fearing the police. I want him to know that they're here to protect him, not hurt him. Her voice quivered, but her resolve was clear. Several other community members spoke, sharing stories of mistrust, frustration, and fear. Each testimony added weight to the room, building a tapestry of lived experiences that demanded to be acknowledged. When it was the police officer's turn, the atmosphere grew tense. Officer Emily Carter stood first, her voice firm but vulnerable. I've worn this badge for 5 years. I took an oath to protect and serve, but I failed to protect Jasmine that day. I let my silence contribute to the problem, and I'm sorry. She glanced at Jasmine, her eyes glistening. I promise to do better, not just for you, but for everyone. Her honesty broke through some of the tension. People nodded, appreciating her courage to admit fault. Then, to everyone's surprise, Officer Dean Harris stood. The room went still, all eyes on him. His hands trembled slightly, but he faced the crowd. I know many of you don't want to hear from me, he said, his voice low. And I don't blame you. I messed up. I let my biases lead me, and I hurt someone innocent. He looked at Jasmine, his eyes filled with regret. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to learn, to be better, and to help make things right. The room was silent. The vulnerability in his voice was raw, unfiltered. For the first time, the hardened barrier around his heart seemed to crack. The dialogue stretched into the evening, with moments of tension, tears, and, eventually, hope. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus returned to the podium. This is just the beginning, he said. We can't fix everything tonight, but we've taken a step, and we'll keep taking steps together. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations continuing in small groups. Some shook hands with officers, others exchanged cautious smiles. The divide hadn't been fully bridged, but the foundation had been laid. Jasmine stood by the door, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. As Dean walked past, he paused. Thank you for giving this a chance, he murmured. She met his eyes, her voice calm. It's up to you what you do with it. The early morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the Brookwood Police Department, casting patterns on the pale blue walls. The atmosphere inside the building felt strangely subdued, a quiet tension replacing the usual hum of daily activity. The events of the past weeks had left their mark, and today was another step in a long journey toward redemption, accountability, and change. Officer Dean Harris sat alone in the break room, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The scent of burnt roast did little to settle the knot in his stomach. He hadn't slept much in days, each night haunted by the memory of Jasmine Taylor's tear-filled eyes and the realization of his own failure. He'd attended the community dialogue sessions, each word, each story, and each tear, another brick added to the wall of shame he'd built around himself. He thought he understood the world he lived in, but now he saw how narrow and clouded his view had been. Today, Chief Marcus Bennett had called him in for a one-on-one meeting. The chief had promised him a choice, a path toward redemption, or a door out of the force forever. He took a shaky breath, his thoughts swirling. Could he change? Did he deserve to? The guilt weighed heavily, but beneath it was something fragile, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. The door to Chief Bennett's office loomed large and imposing. Dean knocked softly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Come in," came the steady voice from within. Dean stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The office was neatly organized, the walls lined with commendations, photographs, and reminders of justice and integrity. Behind the desk sat Marcus Bennett, his expression calm but unreadable. "Take a seat, Harris," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Dean lowered himself into the chair, his hands gripping his knees. Marcus leaned back, studying the officer in front of him. The man who had once been so certain, so rigid in his assumptions, now looked lost, stripped of his confidence, but perhaps open in a way he hadn't been before. "Do you know why you're here today?" Marcus asked, his voice even. Dean nodded. "To decide if I still belong here." Marcus's gaze was steady. "You don't need me to tell you that your actions damaged this department's reputation, not to mention the harm you caused to my daughter and our community. The easy thing for me to do would be to let you go. The community wants justice, and sometimes justice looks like punishment." Dean's throat tightened. He braced for the words he knew might come. "But," Marcus continued, "I don't believe in giving up on people who are willing to change. I've seen glimpses of that willingness in you. The question is, are you ready to prove it?" Dean's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "This isn't a free pass. It's a hard road. It means admitting your faults, confronting your biases head-on, and working to repair the trust you've shattered. It means being part of the solution, not the problem. I'm offering you a spot in the department's reform program. But it's going to take everything you've got." Dean swallowed hard. The weight of the offer settled over him. He thought of the community meetings, of Jasmine's courage, of the shame that had become his constant companion. Could he face it all and try to rebuild? "I want to try, Chief," Dean said, his voice shaky but sincere. "I want to do the work. I need to make this right." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "This isn't a free pass. It's a hard road. It means admitting your faults, confronting your biases head-on, and working to repair the trust you've shattered. It means being part of the solution, not the problem. I'm offering you a spot in the department's reform program. But it's going to take everything you've got." Dean swallowed hard. The weight of the offer settled over him. He thought of the community meetings, of Jasmine's courage, of the shame that had become his constant companion. Could he face it all and try to rebuild? "I want to try, Chief," Dean said, his voice shaky but sincere. "I want to do the work. I need to make this right." Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Good. You're on probation. You'll attend every training session, every community outreach event, and you'll be shadowed by Officer Carter. Slip up once, and you're out. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Dean replied, determination hardening his voice. Marcus extended his hand. Dean grasped it, a silent promise passing between them. After leaving the chief's office, Dean walked down the hallway, his footsteps heavy. He knew what he had to do next. The hardest part of all. Jasmine had agreed to meet him in one of the smaller conference rooms. He paused outside the door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in," came her familiar voice. Dean entered, his eyes immediately finding Jasmine seated at the table, her hands clasped in her lap. Beside her sat Marcus, his presence a silent shield of protection. Dean's mouth was dry, his palms sweating. He cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Jasmine nodded, her gaze guarded. "I'm here to listen." Dean's heart pounded as he began. "I can't take back what I did to you. I can't undo the pain I caused. But I need you to know, I'm sorry. Not just for what happened that day, but for all the ways I let my biases cloud my judgment. I've spent my whole career thinking I was a good cop, but I was blind." He looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm ready to change, but I know it's going to take more than words." Jasmine studied him for a long moment. The anger that had once bubbled up inside her had cooled, replaced by a cautious hope. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said honestly, "but I do believe people can change if they're willing to do the work." Dean nodded, accepting her words. "I will. I promise." A heavy silence hung between them, but it wasn't hopeless. It was the silence of a bridge being built, plank by plank. Over the next few weeks, Dean threw himself into the reform program. He attended every training session on bias, empathy, and de-escalation. The lessons were uncomfortable, confronting him with truths he had long ignored. Officer Emily Carter shadowed him, her presence a reminder that accountability wasn't optional. Community outreach events became part of his routine. He listened to residents, heard their fears, and slowly began to see them not as suspects, but as people, each with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. At one event, a young boy asked him, "Are you a good cop now?" Dean's throat tightened, but he answered honestly, "I'm trying to be." One evening, after a long day of training, Dean received a text from Marcus. "Meet me at the community center. Jasmine's speaking tonight." Dean arrived quietly, standing at the back of the rooms as Jasmine took the stage. She spoke of hope, change, and the importance of second chances for everyone. As she finished, her eyes found his in the crowd. She gave a small nod, a sign that maybe, just maybe, redemption was within reach. Dean's chest tightened. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it. The winds of change had begun to sweep through Brookwood. What had started as a tense confrontation between law enforcement and the community was now transforming into an opportunity for growth, healing, and redemption. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The Brookwood Police Department bustled with activity as officers gathered for the first official day of the department's mandatory reform and training program. The usual chatter of daily business was replaced by a sense of cautious anticipation. Posters promoting justice, empathy, and unity adorned the walls, vibrant reminders of the commitment to change. Officer Dean Harris, once a man of steely confidence and rigid views, now entered the briefing room with a humbler demeanor. He scanned the faces of his fellow officers, some determined, others skeptical. He felt the weight of his mistakes, but also the potential for growth. Standing at the front of the room, Chief Marcus Bennett exuded quiet authority. He cleared his throat, the room falling silent as all eyes turned to him. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Brookwood PD. What happened with Jasmine Taylor wasn't an isolated incident. It was a wake-up call. We have a responsibility to rebuild trust with the community we serve. That means confronting our biases, learning to de-escalate situations, and seeing the humanity in every person we encounter." His gaze lingered on Dean for a moment, then swept across the room. "This won't be easy, and it won't be comfortable. but growth never is. A murmur of agreement and a few nods rippled through the crowd. The conference room, usually reserved for tactical meetings, had been converted into a training space. A large screen displayed the words, implicit bias and de-escalation training. At the front stood Dr. Vanessa Clark, a renowned expert in law enforcement reform. Her presence commanded respect, her sharp eyes sweeping across the gathered officers. "Good morning, officers," Dr. Clark greeted, her voice firm but approachable. "We're here today to tackle the uncomfortable truths that impact how you do your job. We all have biases. It doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human. But, as law enforcement officers, it's your duty to recognize those biases and ensure they don't affect the way you serve the community." She clicked the remote, and an image of a young boy with his hands up filled the screen. The caption read, "What do you see?" Murmurs filled the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Your perception of this image is shaped by your experiences, your background, and your biases," Dr. Clark explained. "But, as officers, you have to look beyond your assumptions. You have to see people, not stereotypes." Dean's chest tightened as he recalled the moment he'd pulled Jasmine out of the SUV, her fear, her confusion, all because he'd seen what he wanted to see, not what was real. The training moved into interactive exercises designed to challenge perceptions and develop empathy. Officers were paired up and given scenarios to role-play. Some were straightforward, resolving a neighbor dispute or assisting a lost child. Others were more complex, requiring them to de-escalate confrontations without resorting to force. Dean was paired with Officer Emily Carter. The tension between them was palpable. She had been the one to testify against him, and he couldn't blame her. But now, they were partners in change. The scenario given to them was tense. A teenager suspected of shoplifting refused to comply with an officer's instructions. Dean took a deep breath, stepping into the role of the officer. Emily played the teen, her body language defiant. "Hey, slow down," Dean said gently, his voice calm. "I'm not here to make this worse. I just want to talk. Can you tell me what's going on?" Emily crossed her arms. "Why should I? You're just gonna arrest me anyway." "No, I'm not," Dean replied, forcing himself to maintain eye contact and stay composed. "I want to understand. If there's a mistake, we'll figure it out together." The words felt foreign in his mouth, but they also felt right. He was learning, slowly, painfully, but learning nonetheless. Dr. Clark nodded approvingly. "That's progress, Harris. Remember, communication is your strongest tool." The reforms extended beyond the walls of the station. Community outreach events were now regular fixtures in Brookwood. Officers were required to attend, to listen, and to engage with the people they served. On a crisp Saturday morning, Dean found himself at a local community center, setting up chairs for a town hall meeting. He was joined by Officer Carter, Jasmine, and activist Michelle Green. The room slowly filled with residents, parents, teenagers, elders, all wearing expressions that ranged from wary to hopeful. Jasmine stood at the front, her presence confident and serene. Dean watched her, a mix of admiration and guilt swirling within him. She had faced injustice and humiliation, yet here she was, leading the charge for change. "Thank you all for being here," Jasmine began, her voice clear. "We're not here to point fingers. We're here to build bridges." A middle-aged man stood up, his voice tinged with frustration. "How do we know this isn't just another empty promise?" Dean took a deep breath, his palms sweaty. This was his moment to step forward. "I understand why you'd feel that way," he said, his voice steady. I made mistakes, big ones. I can't undo what I did, but I can promise to be better. We all can." There was a long pause. Then a woman in the back nodded slowly. "We'll hold you to that." Dean nodded back, his heart pounding. This was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the changes took root. Officers attended workshops, participated in role-playing exercises, and spent time volunteering in the community. Slowly, perceptions began to shift. Dean became a fixture at these events. He listened more than he spoke, learning from the very people he once dismissed. It was humbling, but it was necessary. Jasmine, meanwhile, continued to grow as a leader. Her story inspired others to speak out, to demand fairness, and to believe in the possibility of change. Officer Carter became a mentor to younger officers, guiding them with the wisdom of experience and a heart committed to justice. Chief Bennett watched it all unfold, with a quiet sense of pride. The journey wasn't over. It might never be. But the first steps had been taken. One late evening, Dean found himself at the mural that had become a symbol of Brookwood's transformation. It depicted people of all races, hands clasped in unity, the words, "Justice through empathy," painted above. Jasmine stood beside him, their reflections blending into the mural. "It's a long road," Dean said quietly. "It is," Jasmine replied, "but at least we're on it." As they stood there, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the mural. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a hopeful beginning. The Brookwood Community Center buzzed with energy. The normally quiet building had transformed into a beacon of hope and unity. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, displaying powerful words like justice, unity, change, and hope. The stage was adorned with flowers, and a podium stood at the center, waiting to bear witness to a moment that would mark a new chapter in Brookwood's history. Jasmine Taylor stood near the entrance, her fingers tracing the engraved edges of the plaque she had received earlier. Her dress, a shimmering blue, reflected the light, but it was her smile that truly radiated warmth. Beside her, Chief Marcus Bennett adjusted his tie, his eyes glimmering with pride. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Jasmine nodded, her confidence unshakable. "I am, Dad." She glanced around the packed room. Parents, teachers, students, police officers, and community leaders mingled together, their conversations punctuated by laughter and the occasional tear. The tension that had once divided Brookwood was slowly dissolving, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of trust. As the chatter subsided, the Master of Ceremonies, Mrs. Evelyn Harris, stepped up to the podium. A respected teacher and longtime community advocate, her presence commanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice rich with emotion. "Tonight, we come together to celebrate not just individual achievements, but the resilience and courage that have brought us all here. This year has tested us in ways we could never have imagined. But through it all, we've learned, we've grown, and we've come together." A ripple of applause moved through the room. "This evening, we honor those who have shown us the true meaning of bravery, integrity, and the power of change." She paused, looking out into the crowd, her eyes landing on Jasmine. "Our first honoree is someone who faced injustice with grace and turned her pain into a platform for progress. Please welcome Jasmine Taylor." The room erupted in applause as Jasmine made her way to the stage, her heart beating with a steady rhythm of pride and purpose. She stepped up to the podium, the bright lights illuminating her determined face. Jasmine took a deep breath, steadying herself. She looked out at the crowd, her father, her friends, familiar faces from the community, and the officers who were part of her journey. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris," she began, her voice clear and strong. "And thank you all for being here tonight. She paused, letting the silence settle. A few months ago, I was standing on a sidewalk, handcuffed, humiliated, and terrified, all because of what I looked like. In that moment, I felt like everything I had worked for was slipping away, not because of anything I did, but because of someone else's assumptions. The room grew still, the weight of her words settling over the crowd. But that moment didn't break me. It made me stronger, and it made all of us stronger. Because we didn't let hate win. We didn't let fear win. Instead, we chose to confront the ugly truths, to listen, to learn, and to grow. Her gaze shifted to Officer Dean Harris, who was standing at the back of the room. His eyes met hers, a mixture of humility and gratitude in his expression. I learned that change is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's also necessary. And it starts with each of us, with the courage to look at our own flaws and commit to doing better. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. Tonight isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about a community that refused to stay divided. It's about officers who chose to learn. It's about leaders who chose to listen. And it's about the belief that together we can build a better, fairer world. The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of support and admiration that washed over her. As Jasmine stepped back, Mrs. Harris returned to the podium. "Thank you, Jasmine, for your courage and your wisdom beyond your years," she said warmly. "And now, we have another special moment. Officer Dean Harris would like to present an award." A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to Dean as he walked to the stage, his steps slow and deliberate. The weight of his journey was visible in the lines of his face, but there was a lightness in his posture that hadn't been there before. He cleared his throat, gripping the small plaque in his hand. His voice, though shaky, was sincere. "I never thought I'd be standing here tonight," he began. "And I never thought I'd be the one needing to learn the hardest lessons of all. But Jasmine taught me something that no training manual ever could. She taught me about humility, about listening, and about the power of second chances." He turned to Jasmine, his eyes glistening. "Jasmine, your strength has inspired me to be a better officer, and more importantly, a better person. This award is just a small token of gratitude for everything you've done for our community." He handed her the plaque, the engraving reading, "For outstanding courage and advocacy for justice." Jasmine accepted it, and without hesitation, she hugged him. The room was silent for a moment. Then a wave of applause and cheers erupted. The image of a young black woman, embracing the officer who once wronged her, was more powerful than words could express. The rest of the evening was a blur of smiles, tears, and conversations. People who had once stood on opposite sides found common ground. Officers mingled with residents, children laughed and played, and old grudges began to dissolve. Chief Marcus Bennett stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart full. He watched his daughter, her face glowing with happiness, and he knew that despite the pain and struggle, they had made a difference. Michelle Green approached him, a smile on her face. "You did good, Marcus," he chuckled. "We all did." As the ceremony wound down, people slowly made their way to the parking lot. The cool night air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Marcus handed the keys to the luxury SUV to Jasmine. "You drive, sweetheart," he said. "You've earned it." She grinned, slipping into the driver's seat. As they pulled away, the lights of the community center glowed behind them, a symbol of the transformation they had fought for. The road ahead wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to face, biases to confront, and bridges to build. But Brookwood had taken its first steps toward a brighter future, a future where justice, empathy, and unity prevailed. As Jasmine drove through the familiar streets, she whispered to herself, "We did it." And for the first time in a long while, she truly believed it. As Jasmine and Marcus drive off into the night, the glow of the community center fades in the rearview mirror, but the spark of hope remains. Their journey isn't over. It's just the beginning of a story that belongs to all of us. Every one of us has the power to choose how we respond to challenges, to injustice, and to moments that test who we are. This story was about one community's struggle, but it's a reflection of struggles happening in neighborhoods across America. Now, it's your turn to share your thoughts. Have you ever faced or witnessed a moment that challenged your beliefs or changed your perspective? How did you respond? Share your story in the comments below. We want to hear from you because your voice matters. And if this story moved you, if it made you think or feel something new, hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. There are more stories to tell. Stories of courage, redemption, and change. Stories that remind us that we're all in this together. Stay tuned for the next story that will touch your heart and open your mind, because together we can create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay strong, and keep believing in the power of change.